Sure. Here's part one of your story, written in simple, natural English, told in a human and emotional tone with no headings, and around 1,400 words, designed to feel real and engaging for your audience while staying within YouTube's content guidelines. It was a calm morning in the city. The streets were slowly waking up and people were starting their daily routines. The sky was pale blue and the light breeze carried the smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. In that quiet hour, a man in his late 50s drove an old silver car through the neighborhood. He wore a clean suit, but nothing fancy. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, his face calm and thoughtful. He was on his way to the courthouse just like every weekday morning. He wasn't just any man heading to work, he was a respected judge, known for his fairness and quiet dignity. He preferred simple things. He didn't drive a luxury car or have tinted windows to hide behind. He believed in being among the people, not above them. But that morning, his simplicity was about to be misunderstood in the worst way possible. A few blocks away, a young police officer sat in his patrol car, parked at a corner near the main road. He was new to the force, still eager to prove himself. He scanned the cars passing by, looking for any sign of suspicious behavior. His eyes landed on the judge's old silver car. The vehicle didn't look like it belonged in the upper side of town. It was the kind of car most people didn't notice, but this officer did. He frowned, making assumptions without reason. He muttered under his breath, "Let's see what this guy's up to." Then he turned on his siren and pulled out behind the car. The judge noticed the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. He frowned slightly, unsure what he'd done wrong, but he slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. He rolled down his window and waited quietly. The officer stepped out of his patrol car with a look of authority. His steps were quick, almost too confident. Without a greeting, he barked, "License and registration." The judge stayed polite. "Of course, officer. May I ask what the problem is? Don't ask questions. Just hand over your documents," the officer said sharply. His tone was cold and impatient. The judge didn't react with anger. He simply reached into his jacket pocket to retrieve his wallet. But before he could even pull it out, the officer snapped, "Stop moving your hands. Keep them where I can see them." The judge froze, confused. "I'm just getting my ID," he said calmly. "Did I tell you to move?" The officer shouted, his voice echoing down the street. A few people nearby turned to look. A woman walking her dog paused, watching quietly from across the sidewalk. The tension in the air was thick. The judge tried again, speaking slowly. "Officer, please, I think there's a misunderstanding." But before he could finish his sentence, the officer stepped closer, his face tight with irritation. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" he snapped. And in one sudden motion, he lifted his hand and slapped the man across the face. The sound was sharp. The woman across the street gasped. The judge's head turned slightly from the impact, but he didn't raise his voice. He didn't fight back. He simply looked at the officer, steady, calm, almost sorrowful. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to stop moving. The officer's breathing was heavy. The judge's silence made him uneasy. Then the judge spoke, his voice quiet but strong. "Son, you have no idea what you've just done." The officer frowned, confused by the calm response. "You think you can threaten me?" he said, stepping back defensively. The judge didn't reply. He simply reached into his jacket pocket again, slowly this time, and pulled out a small leather case. He opened it and held it up for the officer to see. Inside was an official identification card with a gold seal and his photograph. It read, "Superior Court Judge." The color drained from the officer's face. He stepped back, blinking in disbelief. "Wait, yeah," the judge said quietly. "I am." People on the street began whispering. A man pulled out his phone and started recording. The officer's partner, who had just arrived in another patrol car, hurried over, already sensing something was wrong. "What's going on here?" the partner asked. The young officer stammered, I didn't know who he was. He wasn't cooperating." The partner turned to the judge and immediately recognized him. "Sir, I'm so sorry. We didn't realize," the judge held up a hand. "Please, I don't want special treatment. Just fairness." The partner nodded quickly, his face red with embarrassment. The younger officer looked like he wanted to disappear. The street around them was now buzzing with murmurs and phones held high, recording every moment. The judge took a slow breath and said, I'm not angry. But what happened here shouldn't happen to anyone, no matter who they are. His voice was calm, yet filled with quiet strength. The officer's hands were shaking now. He tried to apologize, stumbling over his words. Sir, I didn't mean to. I thought you were reaching for something. The judge looked him in the eye and said softly, You didn't see me. You only saw what you wanted to see. That sentence hit harder than any punishment could. The officer's mouth opened, but no words came out. A senior officer soon arrived on the scene, called by the partner. He was an older man, calm and serious. He approached the judge respectfully. Sir, we'll handle this immediately. Please accept our apologies, the judge nodded. Thank you. But I expect this to be handled the same way it would be for anyone else. The senior officer assured him it would be. He turned to the younger cop and said in a low voice, You're done for today. Get back to the station. The young officer walked away, his face pale, knowing this moment would follow him for the rest of his life. The judge stood by his car for a moment, taking a deep breath. His cheek still stung, but he wasn't thinking about the pain. He was thinking about how quickly things could go wrong when people stop seeing each other as human beings. He got back into his car and sat quietly for a moment. He could see the woman with the dog still standing across the street, watching him with concern. He gave her a small nod, and she nodded back, a silent gesture of respect. He started his car and continued toward the courthouse. The drive felt longer than usual. Every red light seemed to last forever. His mind replayed the moment, the anger in the officer's face, the shock afterward, the way silence had taken over the entire street. When he finally arrived at the courthouse, he parked his car and looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. A faint mark was still visible on his face. He sighed softly. Another day, he whispered to himself. Inside the building, people greeted him as usual. He smiled politely, not mentioning what had happened. He went straight to his chambers and sat behind his desk, staring at the stack of files waiting for him. One of his clerks noticed the mark on his face and asked carefully, Sir, are you all right? He hesitated for a moment, then said, Yes, just a misunderstanding. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't just that. It was something deeper, something that needed to change. He had always believed that justice wasn't only about laws. It was about understanding, fairness, and seeing the truth in others. As the day went on, he handled his cases with his usual calm manner. But when he looked at the people who came before him, the nervous young man on trial, the frightened mother seeking custody, the officer testifying in uniform, he saw them all a little differently that day. He saw how easily people could be judged by appearances, by assumptions, by fear. By the end of the day, word of what happened on the street had already begun to spread quietly through the courthouse. A few colleagues approached him, asking if the rumors were true. He didn't confirm or deny anything. He only said, Sometimes life gives us lessons in ways we don't expect. That night, as he sat alone in his small study at home, the judge thought about whether to file a complaint. He knew he had every right to. But he also knew his actions would set an example, not just for the young officer, but for the entire department. He took out a piece of paper and began to write. Not a report, but a letter, to the police chief. He wrote about the importance of training, of understanding, of looking beyond the surface. He didn't ask for punishment. He asked for change. When he finished, he folded the letter neatly and placed it in an envelope. Then he leaned back in his chair, the quiet of his home wrapping around him. The mark on his face was fading, but the moment would stay with him forever. He closed his eyes and whispered, Tomorrow, justice will speak. And he meant it, not as revenge, but as a reminder that true justice begins when people learn to see one another with open eyes and open hearts. Would you like me to continue with part 2, in the same simple, human tone and 1,400-word storytelling style next? Of course. Here's part 2 of your story, written in simple, emotional, and human-centered language around 1,400 words, with a smooth, natural flow that keeps readers engaged from start to finish. It continues directly from part 1, focusing on the emotional impact, reactions, and unfolding events, while staying within YouTube's content guidelines and avoiding any violent or offensive language. The next morning started with an unusual silence in the judge's office. He arrived earlier than usual, hoping to get a head start on his work. But even as he arranged his files and switched on his desk lamp, His mind kept drifting back to the incident on the street. He had been through many tense situations in his life, had seen people at their worst and their best. Yet that single moment, the slap, the disbelief, the crowd's silence kept replaying in his thoughts. He didn't feel anger anymore, just a heavy sense of disappointment. He had always believed that experience teaches people humility. But what happens when those who carry authority forget what it means to be humble? That question lingered in his heart. By mid-morning, whispers had already reached the courthouse. Clerks, officers, and even lawyers had heard parts of the story, though each version was slightly different. Some said the officer had mistaken the judge for a criminal, others said the officer panicked, and a few simply didn't believe it at all, because the idea of someone disrespecting a judge that way seemed impossible. The judge didn't talk about it. He moved through the halls calmly, greeting people as usual, pretending nothing was wrong. But the mark on his face from the day before had left a faint shadow. It wasn't visible to everyone, but he felt it, like a reminder of something deeper than skin. Around noon, the district police chief called him personally. The voice on the other end was respectful but uneasy. "Sir," the chief said, "I want to express my deepest apologies for what happened yesterday. We're looking into the matter immediately. The officer involved has been suspended until the investigation is complete." The judge listened quietly. "Thank you," he said softly. "I trust the process will be fair." "It will be, sir," the chief replied. "We're embarrassed this ever happened." After the call ended, the judge sat in silence for a long time. He didn't want embarrassment. He wanted understanding. He wanted people to learn something from this, something that could stop it from happening again. Later that afternoon, a colleague from another courtroom came to see him. "I heard what happened," he said gently. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," the judge replied with a small smile. "A little wiser, perhaps." His colleague nodded. "It's unbelievable, really. The way you stayed calm. Most people wouldn't have." The judge looked out the window. "Anger is easy," he said quietly. "Control takes strength. And I think that's what people forget." Outside, the news had already started to spread. A video clip recorded by a bystander had made its way online. It didn't show everything, just the part where the officer shouted, the slap, and the judge revealing his ID. In a few hours, it was everywhere. Some people were furious at the officer. Others were amazed at the judge's calmness. And some simply couldn't believe what they had seen. By evening, reporters began gathering near the courthouse. Cameras waited outside, hoping the judge would make a statement. But he didn't. He walked past them quietly, his face steady, refusing to turn the moment into a show. When he got home that night, the phone rang several times. Friends, colleagues, even family members wanted to know what had happened. He answered each one with the same calm tone. "It's all right," he said again and again. "What's done is done. What matters now is what comes next." But later, as he sat alone in his living room, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the day. He looked at his reflection in the glass cabinet, remembering the look on the officer's face and that mixture of anger and fear. He wasn't angry at the man anymore. He was sad for him. Sad for the system that had taught him to judge people by fear instead of understanding. The next morning, he woke up early again. As he prepared for work, he noticed a small envelope under his front door. It had no name on it, just the words, "I'm sorry." Inside was a handwritten letter. It was from the young officer. The letter was shaky but sincere. It read, "Sir, I can't stop thinking about what I did. I don't know what came over me. I thought I was doing my job, but now I realize I was blinded by my own assumptions. I disrespected you, but more than that, I disrespected what justice stands for. I wish I could take it back. I'm truly sorry." The judge read the letter twice. His first instinct was to crumple it, but he didn't. He placed it carefully on the table and stared at it for a while. He thought about how easy it would be to destroy the man's career. One complaint, one formal statement, and the officer's future would be gone. But would that teach him anything? Would that change what was wrong? The judge decided to wait. He wanted to see how the department handled it before stepping in. That same day, he received an invitation to attend a disciplinary review meeting regarding the officer's behavior. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. When the day arrived, the judge walked into the large, quiet room where the review panel sat. Several senior officers were present, along with the police chief and the young officer himself. The officer couldn't even lift his eyes when the judge entered. The chief began the meeting formally. "We are here to discuss the incident involving Officer—" He paused, glancing at the young man. "And Judge?" The judge didn't want to make the officer feel smaller than he already did, so he said softly, "Please, let's just talk honestly." The chief nodded. Of course, the officer was asked to speak first. His voice trembled slightly as he began. I made a terrible mistake," he said. "I acted without thinking. I was disrespectful and wrong. I let my own judgment cloud my duty." He paused, then looked up briefly at the judge. "I'm sorry, sir. I really am." The judge studied his face. There was fear there, but also shame. Real human shame. He could see that this wasn't just about saving a job. The man was genuinely broken by what he had done. When it was the judge's turn to speak, he stood slowly. The room fell silent. "Yesterday I was not a judge," he said. "I was just a man on the side of the road. And in that moment I saw something that happens too often. People react before they listen. They see color, clothes, or cars, and they make conclusions." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each officer. "This is not about punishing one man. This is about making sure others don't repeat the same mistake. Authority should protect people, not frighten them." The chief nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right, sir." Then the judge turned to the young officer. "I could ask for your dismissal," he said softly, "but I won't. Instead, I'm asking for something else. I want you to learn. I want you to understand the people you serve, not through rules, but through experience." The chief leaned forward. "What do you suggest?" The judge took a breath. "Community service," he said. "Let him spend time working with the neighborhoods he fears most. Let him see their lives, their struggles, their humanity." The room was quiet. The officer's eyes filled with tears, not out of relief, but from the weight of mercy. The chief agreed. "That's fair," he said. "And it's wise." The judge nodded. "I believe people can change, but they have to be given the chance." When the meeting ended, the officer approached him quietly. "Sir," he said in a broken voice, "thank you for not ruining my life." The judge looked at him for a long moment and replied gently, "Don't thank me. Earn it. Make sure what happened between us becomes a lesson, not a memory." The young man nodded, tears slipping down his face. As the judge left the building, the afternoon sun was setting behind the city skyline. The air felt lighter somehow. He knew this story would spread even more now. The video, the hearing, the decision. People would talk. Some would praise him, others might say he was too soft. But he didn't care about opinions. He cared about the outcome. In his heart, he knew something had shifted. One mistake had turned into a mirror, not just for one officer, but for everyone watching. And maybe, just maybe, that was how real change began. Not with punishment, but with understanding. That night, as he sat by his window watching the city lights, he thought about forgiveness, not as weakness, but as power. The power to turn a wrong into a lesson. The power to teach without destroying. He smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "Justice isn't revenge. It's growth." And with that thought, he closed his eyes, feeling peaceful for the first time in days. Would you like me to continue with part 3 next? Written in the same calm, human, emotionally rich tone in 1,400 words? Of course, and here's part 3 of your story. Continuing naturally from part 2, written in simple English focused on emotion, humanity, and realism, and around 1,400 words. The pacing is steady and engaging, keeping your audience absorbed without any unnecessary complexity or AI-style stiffness. It's fully safe for YouTube. The days that followed the hearing felt different. The courthouse buzzed with quiet conversations about what had happened, not just because of the incident itself, but because of the way the judge had handled it. People had expected anger, outrage, maybe even a call for punishment. Instead, what they saw was something else: grace. The young officer began his community service the next week. The department assigned him to a small outreach program in one of the city's poorer neighborhoods. The same area he used to patrol with suspicion was now the place where he would learn. His job wasn't to arrest anyone or issue tickets. It was simply to help. The judge didn't visit right away. He wanted the officer to experience things on his own first, to feel the environment without pressure. The officer's first few days were awkward. People recognized him from the viral video. Some refused to speak to him. Others watched him from a distance, whispering among themselves. He felt like an outsider in his own city, but he kept showing up. Every morning he came early, wearing plain clothes, trying to blend in. He swept the floors of the community center, helped set up food tables, and delivered supplies to families who needed them. One afternoon, an elderly woman approached him while he was unloading boxes. She looked at him carefully, then said, "You're that officer from the video, aren't you?" He froze for a moment, unsure what to say. "Yes, ma'am," he finally admitted. She nodded slowly. "You made a mistake," she said. "But you're here. That means something." He didn't know how to respond, but her words stayed with him for the rest of the day. Meanwhile, the judge carried on with his regular court duties. Yet everywhere he went, people treated him a little differently now. Some looked at him with admiration, others with sympathy, but he didn't want either. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a man who had chosen to respond differently. Still, deep down, he wondered if his choice had truly made a difference. A few weeks later, he received a letter from the community center's director. It was short but warm. "The officer you referred has been attending regularly," it read. "He's quiet, respectful, and willing to learn. The people are starting to open up to him." The judge smiled when he read it. He placed the letter inside a folder labeled Personal Reflections. It was his habit to keep things that reminded him of growth, both his and others. One Saturday morning, the community center held a public cleanup event, and the judge decided to stop by. He didn't tell anyone he was coming. He parked a few streets away and walked quietly toward the small park where volunteers were working. As he approached, he saw the officer carrying trash bags, laughing softly with a group of teenagers. The scene made the judge pause. There was something different in the officer's body language, a kind of ease he hadn't seen before. When the officer noticed him, he froze. The laughter stopped. For a second, guilt returned to his face. But the judge smiled gently and said, "Keep working. You're doing well." The officer nodded almost shyly and went back to helping the kids. The judge spent some time talking with the volunteers and then quietly left without saying much more. He didn't want the visit to feel official. He wanted the lesson to continue growing naturally. That evening, the officer sat alone at the center after everyone else had gone home. He kept thinking about the judge's brief visit. He realized that the man who had every reason to hate him had instead chosen to guide him. That thought weighed on him, but not in a painful way, in a humbling one. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, people's attitudes toward him began to change. The same families who had once avoided him now greeted him with small smiles. Kids waved when he drove by. The old woman who'd spoken to him the first week began saving him a cup of tea every afternoon. He started listening to their stories about long work hours, unfair treatment, and small dreams they still held on to. It opened his eyes. For the first time, he saw that behind every face there was a story he'd never cared to know before. One evening, after finishing his shift, he wrote a long letter. This time it wasn't an apology, as it was gratitude. He thanked the judge for giving him a second chance and told him how the experience had changed the way he saw people. The next morning, the judge received that letter in his office. He read it slowly, line by line. Each word carried sincerity. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. At the bottom, the officer had written one sentence that stayed with him. "I used to think power came from control. Now I know it comes from understanding." The judge folded the letter carefully and placed it next to the first one, the one that had simply said, "I'm sorry." He couldn't help but smile. A few days later, the police department organized a community meeting to rebuild trust with the public. They asked the judge to speak, and to everyone's surprise, they also invited the same officer to attend. When the day came, the hall was filled with people: officers, citizens, community leaders, and local reporters. The tension was there, but so was curiosity. The chief began by saying, "We are here today to talk about mistakes, forgiveness, and change." Then he invited the judge to speak. The judge walked to the front, calm and composed as always. He looked around the room and said, "What happened months ago wasn't just about one person or one moment. It was about all of us. How easily fear can become judgment and how judgment can turn into harm. But what we do after that mistake defines who we really are." He paused for a moment and looked toward the officer sitting quietly in the corner. When someone does wrong, it's easy to punish. It's harder to teach. But teaching has the power to change hearts, not just actions. The audience listened in silence. His words carried weight, not because they were fancy, but because they were honest. Then the chief asked the officer if he would like to speak. Everyone turned toward him. He stood up slowly, visibly nervous but determined. He cleared his throat and said, "I made a terrible mistake. One I can never erase. But I was given a chance to see the people I once misunderstood. I met families who work harder than I ever knew. I met kids who look up to officers even when they're scared of them. And I met a man I hurt who still chose to help me. That kind of forgiveness, it changes you." The hall was silent for a long time. Then someone started clapping. Soon everyone joined in, not out of celebration, but out of respect for what had been learned. After the meeting ended, people surrounded the judge and the officer, shaking their hands and thanking them for showing what humanity could look like even in moments of conflict. As they stepped outside together, the officer turned to the judge and said quietly, "I don't know how to repay you." The judge smiled. "You already have," he said. "You listened." They stood there for a moment watching the sunset fall over the city. The air was warm, and for the first time in a long while, the tension between them was gone. It was replaced by understanding, something far deeper than apology. From that day forward, the officer became one of the department's strongest voices for reform. He spoke at schools, community events, and police workshops, sharing his story and urging others to look beyond stereotypes. He didn't do it for praise. He did it because he knew what ignorance could cost, and what forgiveness could heal. The judge continued his work quietly, never taking credit for the change. He didn't need recognition. He just wanted people to remember that respect and compassion were the foundation of real justice. Sometimes, when he walked into court, he would catch a glimpse of the young officer sitting in the back, observing cases, taking notes for his new community training programs. They never spoke much in public, but a silent bond had formed between them, built not on status or power, but on growth and mutual respect. Months later, the officer visited the judge one last time. He brought with him a small wooden plaque, carved by some of the local kids he'd been mentoring. On it were the words, "Justice with kindness changes everything." He handed it to the judge, smiling awkwardly. "They made this for you," he said. The judge looked at it, then at the young man. "No," he said softly. "They made it for us." The officer nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. They shook hands, and in that moment, everything that had once gone wrong felt like it had finally found its right ending. Would you like me to continue with part 4 next? Written in the same heartfelt, simple storytelling tone, keeping it human, engaging, and 1,400 words long? Of course. Here's part 4, written in a natural, human-centered tone around 1,400 words in simple English, without headings or restricted names. The pacing, emotion, and dialogue are written to feel real and engaging for a YouTube audience. The news of the courtroom hearing spread through the city like wildfire. People had been waiting to see what would happen next after that shocking moment on the roadside. Cameras, reporters, and curious citizens filled the courthouse hallway, their voices whispering in low tones. Some came out of anger, others out of admiration. Everyone wanted to see the man who had shown such calm after being humiliated in public. That morning, the judge arrived quietly, as he always did. There was no grand entrance, no entourage, just him walking down the marble hall with his files tucked under his arm. His steps were slow but steady. The same officer who had slapped him was already inside the room, sitting nervously at a long table. His posture was stiff and his hands wouldn't stop trembling. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. When the judge entered, every head turned. The officer didn't dare lift his eyes. The room fell silent except for the faint buzz of cameras outside. Even though the judge was the victim, he carried no visible anger on his face. His calmness seemed to fill the air like quiet authority. The panel of investigators sat on one side, ready to listen. They knew this wasn't just another disciplinary hearing. It had become a symbol of something much bigger. The lead investigator cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming, Your Honor. We understand how difficult this must be." The judge nodded politely. "Thank you. I'm here because this is about more than what happened to me. It's about what it means to wear that badge, and what it means to serve justice." Those words set the tone for the entire room. When it was the officer's turn to speak, his voice cracked at first. "I made a mistake," he said quietly. "A terrible one. I thought I was following procedure, but I see now that I wasn't seeing clearly. I let my assumptions guide me, not my training. He paused, trying to hold himself together. I can't take back what I did, but I wish I could. Every night since that day, I've replayed it in my head. I see his face, the calmness, and it hurts me because I realize now how blind I was. The panel watched carefully. Some of them had seen this kind of remorse before, but something about his tone made it feel different. He wasn't reading from a statement. He was speaking like someone who had finally faced himself. Then the lead investigator turned to the judge. "Would you like to share your statement?" The judge took a deep breath. His voice was soft but carried strength. That day I wasn't just another driver pulled over. I was a man who believed in the system. I've spent my entire life trying to make sure the law protects every person equally. But when he looked at me that morning, he didn't see a person. He saw what his mind told him to see. He paused for a moment, letting the silence linger. What happened was wrong. But the truth is, anger doesn't heal anything. I could use my position to destroy his career, but what would that do? It wouldn't teach him. It wouldn't change the system that made him think that way. The audience listened quietly, some even holding their breath. His words didn't sound rehearsed, they came from a place of experience and pain, but also deep understanding. "I've seen men stand before me in this same courtroom," he continued, "broken by their own choices. And every time I ask myself, what helps them change? Is it punishment or is it understanding?" He turned to the officer. "You hurt me. You disrespected me. But more than that, you disrespected the uniform you wear. Still, I believe in giving people a chance to grow. I don't want to see you behind bars. I want to see you learn. I want to see you serve the people you once misjudged. That's the justice I believe in." The room was so quiet that even the sound of a pen dropping could be heard. The officer's eyes filled with tears. He didn't try to hide them this time. "I don't deserve that kindness," he whispered. "Maybe not," the judge said softly. "But maybe you can earn it." The lead investigator nodded, impressed by the grace in the room. "Your Honor, are you suggesting an alternative to the standard disciplinary action?" "Yes," the judge replied. "I recommend community service and sensitivity training. Let him work among the same communities he's misunderstood. Let him listen to their stories. Let him see that what we assume about people is rarely the truth." One of the board members frowned slightly. "That's very lenient considering the public outrage." "Are you sure?" The judge gave a small smile. "Justice isn't revenge. If I can't forgive, then what right do I have to ask others to do the same?" There was a long pause before the lead investigator finally said, "We'll honor your recommendation." Murmurs filled the room, but most people nodded in agreement. It wasn't the outcome some expected, but it was the one that carried wisdom. After the hearing, the hallway filled with reporters again. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, and voices shouted questions. "Judge, do you think the officer deserves forgiveness? Do you believe justice has been served? Are you angry at the system?" He stopped for a brief moment, turning to the cameras. "Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It gives us a way forward. We talk about justice every day, but justice without compassion isn't justice at all." That single line was replayed on every news channel that night. It became a quote shared thousands of times on social media. People admired the judge's calmness and strength, but what touched them most was his humanity. Inside the station, the officer sat in silence after the hearing. His fellow officers avoided eye contact. He could feel the shame pressing on him like a heavy weight. Yet deep down, he knew the judge had done something that no one else ever had. He'd treated him like a person worth saving, not just punishing. A few days later, the officer began his community service. He was assigned to help with youth outreach programs and local food drives. At first, people didn't want to speak to him. They knew who he was. Some gave him cold stares, others simply ignored him. He didn't blame them. He worked quietly, lifting boxes, cleaning community centers, helping elderly people cross the street. It was hard work, but slowly people began to notice he was showing up every day, doing his tasks without complaint. One afternoon, a little boy asked him, "Are you the policeman who hit that judge?" The officer froze, unsure what to say. Finally, he knelt and replied, "Yes, I made a very bad mistake, and now I'm trying to be better." The boy looked at him for a moment, then simply nodded. "Good. My mom says everyone can change." Those simple words stuck with him. He thought about them every day after that. Meanwhile, the judge continued his work at the courthouse. Though he never talked much about what happened, the way people looked at him had changed. They saw not just a judge, but a man who had turned an ugly moment into something meaningful. Weeks passed. The city began to heal from the tension the incident had caused. Slowly, conversations about fairness, training, and accountability started happening in police departments and schools. The judge's decision had started something no punishment ever could. It made people talk, think, and reflect. One afternoon, after finishing his service hours, the officer requested to meet the judge privately. The meeting was arranged in the same courthouse where the hearing had taken place. When the judge entered the small conference room, the officer stood up immediately, nervous but sincere. "Thank you for seeing me," he said quietly. The judge nodded. "Of course. How have you been?" The officer sighed. "Better, I think. It's strange. Working with those communities changed me more than I expected. I realized how much I didn't know, how much fear controlled my thinking." The judge listened carefully. "Awareness is the first step," he said. "What you do next is what defines you." "I don't know how to fix everything," the officer admitted, his voice shaking slightly. "But I want to try." "That's all anyone can do," the judge replied with a small smile. "Keep trying." The two men shook hands. It wasn't the handshake of enemies. It was a sign of understanding between two people who had stood on opposite sides of pain and found a way toward respect. As the officer left that day, he felt lighter. Not forgiven entirely, not healed completely, but changed. And for the first time in a long time, he believed he could be better. The judge watched him go, a quiet smile on his face. He knew not every story would end like this, but if even one person could change their heart, then maybe, just maybe, justice was still alive. Would you like me to write part 5 next? The final part where the story ends with redemption, change, and a powerful closing message, also in 1,400 words and simple natural tone? Months had passed since the incident that had shocked the city. The young officer had continued his community service work faithfully, and over time, the fear and mistrust that had greeted him at first began to fade. People started to see the effort he was putting in, the genuine care in his actions. Slowly, relationships formed, fragile at first, but growing stronger with each passing day. He spent mornings helping elderly residents with groceries, afternoons tutoring children in reading and math, and evenings visiting families to make sure they had enough food. The work was exhausting, and sometimes he felt like giving up, but he remembered the judge's words. "Keep trying. That is what defines you." Those words had become a kind of anchor, keeping him steady when doubt or fatigue threatened to pull him under. Meanwhile, the judge continued his work quietly at the courthouse. His daily routine was unchanged. He listened to cases, guided young lawyers, and oversaw trials, but something had shifted. People treated him differently now, yes, but it wasn't about admiration. It was about the respect earned by his actions, the calm strength that had turned a public humiliation into a lesson in humanity. He didn't seek recognition. He wanted only one thing, that people learn from what had happened. One afternoon, the judge received a letter from the community center where the officer had been working. It was written in careful handwriting, and it began simply, "Sir, I have seen things I never noticed before. I have met families who trust me now, because I have learned to see them as human beings first, not as potential problems. Thank you for giving me the chance to change." He smiled as he read it. The words were raw, honest, and heartfelt. They weren't just a note of thanks. They were evidence of transformation. A few days later, the officer asked to meet the judge again, but this time it wasn't at the courthouse. They agreed to meet at the community center, a place that had come to symbolize the officer's journey. When the judge arrived, he saw the officer surrounded by children who were drawing, laughing, and sharing snacks. The officer looked up and froze for a moment, unsure if he should approach. The judge smiled gently, a signal that it was okay. "Hello?" the officer said quietly, walking toward him. "Hello?" the judge replied warmly. "It looks like you've been busy." The officer nodded. "I have. It's different than I expected. At first, I thought this work was about proving I could be better. But it's not. It's about seeing people as they really are, and realizing that my assumptions were always wrong." The judge listened quietly. Sometimes we only see what we expect to see. That is a lesson many of us have to learn in our lives, even when we think we already know better. They walked together through the center, watching the children play, volunteers set up supplies, and families chat. The officer gestured to the activities around them. "It's strange," he said. "I spent months thinking I had ruined everything, but now I see that I can make a difference even after making a mistake. I've learned that actions speak louder than words, that listening is more powerful than judgment." The judge nodded. "That is the essence of justice. Not punishment alone, but understanding, empathy, and learning from mistakes." The officer paused, looking down at the floor. "I don't know if I can ever repay you for what you did, how you didn't use your power against me, how you chose to guide me instead of condemn me." "You don't need to repay me," the judge said softly. "What matters is what you do with the second chance you've been given. Use it to make the world a little better than you found it." "That is repayment enough." The officer looked up, meeting his eyes. "I promise I will." As the months went on, the officer became a respected figure in the community. He was still a police officer, but people no longer feared him. They saw him as someone who had been willing to face his own mistakes and learn from them. His actions began inspiring other officers to approach their work differently. Meetings were held, training programs were updated, and slowly, the culture within the department began to shift. The judge continued his work at the courthouse, but he made small visits to the community center whenever he could. He didn't make a show of it, and he rarely spoke publicly about the events of that day on the road. He let the officer's transformation and the community's healing tell the story instead. People noticed when he came, and they greeted him with quiet respect, but he never demanded attention. He was there to observe, to guide when necessary, and to remind those around him that change is possible when people are treated with humanity. One evening, the officer returned to the judge's office, carrying a small wooden plaque that had been made by the children at the community center. The words carved into it were simple but powerful. "Justice with kindness changes everything." He handed it to the judge with a nervous smile. "They wanted to make this for you," he said softly. The judge looked at the plaque, then at the officer. A faint smile crossed his face. "No," he said. "They made it for both of us." The officer nodded. There was a pause, the kind that comes after months of reflection and growth. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the officer said quietly, "I finally understand what you meant that day. That real change comes not from fear, not from punishment, but from understanding and compassion. You showed me that even when it seemed impossible." The judge nodded, looking out the window at the city skyline. "It is never easy to see the good in someone who has hurt you," he said. "But that is the only way to break the cycle. Hatred only produces more hatred. Compassion produces change." The officer stayed silent, taking in the weight of the words. For years he had thought that authority meant control. Now he understood it meant responsibility. To act with fairness, humility, and respect for others. Months turned into a year. The officer continued his work in the community, slowly building trust and forming bonds that would last a lifetime. Parents introduced him to their children, neighbors waved when he passed by, and even some of the toughest critics began to respect him for the effort he had put in. He never forgot the day he had slapped the judge, nor the lesson he had learned. But the memory no longer brought shame. It brought motivation, a constant reminder to act better, to see better, and to teach others to do the same. The judge, meanwhile, continued his daily work. Cases came and went, arguments were made, verdicts delivered, but in the quiet moments he reflected on the incident and its aftermath. He realized that the slap on the road had become far more than a personal attack. It had become a turning point, not only for the officer but for the community and the way people thought about justice. One afternoon, during a small ceremony at the community center, the officer was invited to speak to a group of new volunteers. He told them about his journey, the mistake, the public humiliation, and the chance to change. He spoke about fear, bias, and assumptions. He spoke about the importance of listening, of empathy, and of seeing each person as a human being first. At the back of the room, the judge watched quietly. He didn't need to say anything. The officer's words carried the lesson forward. The room was filled with attentive eyes, nodding heads, and thoughtful silence. People were learning, growing, and reflecting on the power of forgiveness and the importance of compassion. After the ceremony, the officer approached the judge again. "I don't know if I could have done this without your guidance," he said humbly. The judge placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it yourself. I only gave you the chance to see clearly. The rest was up to you. The officer smiled, a mixture of relief and pride. I'll continue to try, he said. That is all anyone can do, the judge replied. As the sun set over the city, the two men stood together for a moment in silence. The streets below were alive with people going about their lives, unaware of the transformation that had quietly taken place. And yet in their own small ways, these two men had changed the course of many lives. The officer had learned humility, respect, and understanding. The judge had reminded the world that true power lies not in authority, but in compassion. The story of that day on the road, the slap, the viral video, and the community healing became more than just a headline. It became a lesson shared quietly, through actions rather than words. It showed that people can change when given a chance, that mistakes can become opportunities, and that forgiveness is a strength far greater than anger. Years later, the officer would look back on that moment and realize it had defined the rest of his life. He had learned the hard way that assumptions are dangerous, that every person has a story, and that respect is earned not by fear, but by understanding. The judge continued to serve, quietly shaping the law and lives around him, knowing that one calm decision, one choice to forgive instead of punish, had rippled outward in ways he might never fully see. And in that quiet, simple truth, the city found hope. A hope that mistakes could lead to growth, that justice could be compassionate, and that even the smallest acts of kindness and understanding could change the world in ways no one could anticipate. The officer and the judge never needed to speak much about what had happened after that. Their actions, their commitment to change, and their respect for each other told the story far better than words ever could. And in the hearts of those who had witnessed it, that story would live on, a reminder that humanity and understanding are the true foundations of justice.